This session is billed as a panel session. It's running in two halves. There's a half between now and 10:30. And then there will be a second session from 11 to, have I got that right? 11 until 12:30. Although it's a panel, it's a kind of slightly unusual panel. So what we're going to do is we're going to have two 15-minute presentations this morning from Megan Knight and then from Brenda Lee. And they're both about different aspects of media reaction to international assessments and how this gets covered. And then we've got two more, slightly more diverse, we move topics slightly after the break. There will be a paper by Cormac O'Keefe and then another paper by Petra. Again, we will have two 15-minute presentations, and what I'm hoping to do is to create some space for discussion on the table immediately afterwards. So we're going to have the two presenters present. I'm going to ask Megan to present, then Brenda to present. There'll be some discussion on the table. Then we'll have questions to each of the individual speakers before the break. We're going to do exactly the same after the break, and then we will have a panel, and there will be four people all sitting up here, and we can have some collective discussion. Okay, so I hope that's clear enough and that everybody's okay and up for that. I've completely forgotten to say who I am. I'm Gemma Moss. Somebody with a very long interest in Pisa and this area and things literacy and quants and all sorts of stuff. And so I'm very much looking forward to the session. So with no more ado, I am going to start Megan off. Megan, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm sort of the imposter in the room, in a way, because my background is not in education. My background is in journalism and journalism research. And what I research broadly is the impact of technology on the practice of journalism, and quite specifically, for the last few years, I've been looking at data journalism and data analysis and how journalists do and don't do it, how they understand data, and what they need in order to get better at it. Part of what I've been doing with that is a lot of work training journalists in data journalism. So I sort of come at this slightly from an academic perspective, but then also slightly from quite a pragmatic application-based perspective of trying to understand what we actually have and how to improve on that. So when I was asked to do this, I was a bit sort of, okay, well, this is not an area I've looked at. So I put together a report. I did a kind of a content analysis of the coverage of what I refer to as the 2013 Pisa report, because it came out in 2013, but I realized it's the 2012 Pisa data. The report was then issued in December 2013. So what I've done is a content analysis. What I'm going to do today is actually kind of race through some of that and then go on to the conclusions. There's a longer paper which I've written, and I do apologize for not getting it to Mary in advance, which I promised, but it is up on my website, and you can always just email me if you'd like to read the full discussion of the content analysis. I'm more than happy to do that, but I realize that's not the point of what I'm doing here. So just a few points about data journalism. It's a buzzword. The media, the news media, are really susceptible to buzzwords. They're susceptible to fashion and trends. The commercialized news media and the public-funded news media has been under immense pressure for the last 20 years. They are an industry in crisis. And one of the things that you see when you see an industry in crisis is a grasping at straws and a grasping at, oh, we can do this and this will save us. This will bring us back to where we were in the glory days of pick a decade. And data journalism got picked up a little bit by this, and there's a lot of reasons why. Some of it goes back to the release of massive tranches of data that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange made available, and The Guardian did a huge data analysis of the Iraq war logs, which kind of triggered a little bit of, oh, wow, we can do this stuff. A lot of organizations say they have data journalists. A lot of organizations say they want data journalists. A fair number of journalism schools say that they train data journalists. This is problematic. It's not, I do a lot of short workshops. I do a lot of kind of 2 weeks, go into a newsroom, and people come out of that saying, ooh, I'm trained in data journalism, and myself and my colleagues who do that roll our eyes and go, if we're lucky, you're trained to realize that you're in no way capable of doing it. And I'm really sorry. But that's actually kind of the goal a lot of the time for me, is to make journalists realize that this is not simple. One of the things about journalists that's quite important for those of you who don't work with them and who don't understand them is we are inherently dabblers. We went into this job because we enjoy the excitement of learning something different every day, and largely find frustrating and tedious the idea of spending the next 3 or 4 years of your life learning one thing. That is absolutely anathema to academics. Okay, so you have to understand that although journalists are very intelligent, generally, their intelligence and the way they approach things is completely different. So for a journalist, you talk to journalists occasionally about, I really want to come to the university and do a PhD, or I do, because I get a lot of journalists saying that. And I say, okay, well, do you really want to spend the next 6 years of your life on one question? And they sort of look at me and go, I'd rather eat live slugs, really seriously. So you have to understand there's a bit of this going on here as well, which creates a problem when you're trying to teach and get people to embrace something like data analysis, because you're not going to pick it up in a week. And journalists are often quite frustrated by that, because they tend to be the sort of people who do pick things up in a week, who do and the good ones are good at that sort of instant stuff. Data analysis is really expensive, and one of the things is if you look at this international consortium now of investigative journalists who've been behind the release of the Panama Papers, which is a direct offshoot from the work that was done by The Guardian and the New York Times and Der Spiegel with the release of the Iraq war log. So Julian Assange hasn't claimed credit for the Panama Papers, but there's a heritage there. Those organizations are massively funded by state and public money, because commercial news organizations, with the possible exception of a handful, and I would include The Guardian and the New York Times in that, although The Guardian, for those of you who are not from the UK, is not a commercial news organization. The Guardian is a non-profit. But most news organizations have nothing like the capacity needed to do this. And when you read the stuff about the Panama Papers, and a lot of people are really surprised to realize they were given to the journalists a year ago. That means that there were journalists, and I actually know a number of them, who have spent the better part of a year being paid a salary to sit in a room with data and then produce the final product. Very, very few news organizations can do that and will pay someone effectively a year's salary to work on a single story. So data analysis, although they say they want it, they can't pay for it. And that's a big chunk of this, because it's time consuming, and you guys work with data. And you largely work with data you've commissioned yourselves, I believe, which makes it a little bit simpler. If you're working with data that someone else has gathered, the work quadruples, because it's never clean and all sorts of other things. So most data journalism, I did an analysis of data journalism in the UK, and most of it is actually coming directly from third parties. It's coming through PR. A lot of non-profit organizations and NGOs, if you look at the data journalism and the data analysis that's presented in the press in the UK right now, the majority of it actually came wholly wrapped, as it were, from an organization with an interest in the subject. So it came from a trade union, or it came from a non-profit organization. It came from an interest group. It comes from a political party. And that's an interesting one for me, because although it raises questions about the work that journalists are doing, this overall question about the extent to which PR has influenced and is continuing to influence journalism is a whole separate issue. But it puts a gap in the market for people who work with this kind of material, that the more you can present this kind of work to a news organization in this format and this structure, the more likely it is to be used. So I looked at things like the absolute direct reuse of tables or of graphs and charts, and then things like where they'd provided raw data and a visualizer had gone and skinned it so it looked like the news organization had done it, but they hadn't. They'd simply tweaked the colors and so on. So there's the paper which I did on that. So what I did was I looked at the 2013 OECD Pisa report, which came out at the beginning of December 2013. I pulled from Nexus, and you were saying that nobody tells you where they get stuff from. People in my field do, actually, and I can tell you about the conventions if you're interested. So I pulled it from Nexus based on the search terms Pisa and OECD. as major mentions. So I dropped anything where the first mention of the Pisa report was below the second paragraph, because I was not interested in things that mentioned it in passing. I was interested in actual coverage. I ended up with 34 articles from national newspapers in the UK, both online and print. The main ones were the Telegraph and the Guardian. Interestingly enough, the Independent, the Daily Mail, the Mirror, and the Times did a little bit of coverage, and the other British tabloids did none. So there was nothing in the Sun, there was nothing in the Express. The Times is warped in terms of its representation because the Times and the Sun actually as well are having an argument with Nexus, so their database is not complete, which is frustrating. It's possible there was coverage which wasn't available. So the focus of the coverage, and I looked at the actual report, and I went through the report initially and said, okay, well, what would you expect? So there were a couple of things that came up. One of them is there are 4 aspects to the test. So there's reading, writing, science, science, reading, maths, and problem solving. Every report mentioned maths. Only 7 mentioned reading or science, and only 1 mentioned problem solving. So what you effectively have is an overpowering perception in the media that this is a test of maths, that there's nothing else to it, and that it was, for most of them, it was simply reported as a maths score. And that to me was quite interesting, particularly because Britain did very well on problem solving. So the UK actually had its best score in problem solving and one of the best scores in the world in problem solving, and it wasn't mentioned. The report then goes on to analyze particular relationships between external factors and scores, and I apologize for this because this is very small. So a couple of ones. One of them was, and I didn't do each specific one, I kind of grouped them. So one is the sort of the motivation, the self-belief, the confidence the students have in themselves and the schooling system. One was economic, the link between the score on the report and economic success, which I personally find very problematic in the report, but that's a separate argument. Expenditure, which was how much each state, each entity that was part of the report spent on it. Gender, immigration, and this to me was another interesting one because the report did explicitly refer to the proportion of immigrants within any given school environment, and none of the British coverage mentioned it, despite the fact that immigration being a massive, massive issue here. Socioeconomic status broadly, stratification in the school system to the extent to which the school system segregates kids at various ages, you guys all know this, and teacher rewards, how much money teachers earn and how much status teachers have. The 2 big ones were expenditure, and a lot of the articles mentioned expenditure, usually in the context of Britain spends a lot of money and we're still failing. There was very much written that way. Teacher rewards were mentioned again, and it was interesting because I did the broad quantitative, it's not really a quantitative content analysis with 34 articles, to be really honest. And then I did a bit of a discourse analysis, which I'll talk about. So the nature of the courage. The first one is there's a narrative of failure, and this is what you picked up on and other people have mentioned, and I think this is now universal. Oh God, okay, I'm almost out of time. So, articles presented the results of evidence of the inadequacy was all constructed in this context of we're failing, we're doing really badly, you know. Secondary narrative, Asia's winning, therefore we're losing. And this idea of it as a zero-sum game was, to me, really frustrating, but really, really evident that no one had actually queried or raised the issue of we could all be moving up, you know, that this isn't an inherent nature of the game, that if we are getting better at maths, someone else must be getting worse at maths. That's completely unrealistic, but it was all presented that way. Politicization, and one of the things that I think was interesting here is that this was released at a point when Parliament was in session. Okay, so this data came out while Parliament was in session in the UK, and again, for those of you from parliamentary democracies, that makes a certain amount of sense. Prime Minister's questions was the next day after the data was released. So Prime Minister's questions on the next day became an argument between Michael Gove and Tristram Hunt, I think, who is the Education Secretary, about these scores. And most of the coverage was highly politicized. So the coverage seems to be as much a coverage of the argument in Parliament as it was a coverage of the report itself. Now that to me is interesting, and I'm seriously considering picking this up again when the next tranche comes out to see if the politicization of this is inherent or whether it was purely coincidental given the timing. We had a new government at the time. It was a relatively new government, and the whole thing was framed as a test for Michael Gove and his radical changes to the education system. Whether that's fair or not is kind of beside the point. The data wasn't discussed. So the data and the actual results were not discussed. Most of them said Singapore came first, Shanghai came second, or vice versa. We came 26th or something. We're doing really badly, we're failing, oh my God, the world will end and the Chinese are going to take over. That was kind of it. There was no discussion of anywhere else. There was no discussion of where the US was. There was no real conversation about, for me, one of the things that was really frustrating is the fact that the report reports raw financial information regarding the cost of educating a child. And no mention is made of the fact that although the Chinese educate their children for a lot less money, they're still paying their teachers way more than the average salary in China, because a dollar goes 3 times as far, even in Shanghai, which is the most expensive city in China. So the economic data for me was intensely frustrating, because you cannot compare raw financial amounts of money across these vast ranges of countries. So only one article critiqued it. And that was interesting. That was a single article that actually said, let's not look at this. And that was in The Guardian. So there was one journalist, Richard Adams, who did critique it. So what does this tell us? A few things. It's superficial, it's simplified. Journalists don't have any time. And people like to say, well, the media don't bother to understand, but it's important to understand. Most journalists got this data 2 days before it was released. Most journalists probably had, if they were lucky, a full working day of 8 hours to prepare their report. If they were lucky. That's how it goes. You've got to be able to present the data in a form that doesn't require them to read it in great depth. I doubt any of these journalists read the full Pisa report, with the possible exception of Richard Adams from The Guardian, who's in a slightly different league. So you need to think about this. It was presented, the math score was presented first, therefore everybody said the math score. That's how it goes. And unfortunately, that is how the media work. So you do need to think about this. Well, if that's the thing we want to focus on, then it goes first. Don't put things on page 6 if you want them covered, because it won't happen. Journalists hate ambiguity, okay? And no matter how ambiguous the report is, and no matter how ambiguous the comment from academics is, it will come out as an absolute, we are better or worse. I can't tell you how to fix that, because it's really hard. If you've developed a good relationship with someone who's a journalist in your field, you can probably persuade them to do it, but you don't get the headlines that say that. Ambiguous stories get killed. They go to the bottom of the page on most commercial news organizations for whom selling papers matters. Data's scary. People don't like data. This is one of the really interesting charts in the report, and I guarantee you none of the journalists have the faintest idea how to interpret that. One of the things, though, here, and this is for me, and I'll go back to the takeaway. I'll go to the end here. The thing is, the best reportage was where a journalist had actually found an expert to interpret for them. And for you, where you are, that's your role. Okay? So one of the things to consider if you do want to intervene in how the OECD data is reported in any environment, then the thing to do is to build a relationship with a journalist well in advance of the release of the report and offer expertise, offer localization, offer interpretation. The report is written for a global audience. It's not rewritten for each country. Most reputable journalists will leap at the chance to have an expert in the subject come in and say, okay, it came out, I've gone through it, I've looked at what this means for us, for our country, for our state. That's how you intervene. The last point is everyone likes to bash the media, okay? But it's an industry in crisis, and it's a little bit unfair in a way, and I'm arguing, don't kick them while they're down. Most of them right now are terrified of losing their jobs. So this idea that, oh, it's all the media's fault. It is, but it's the institutional media's fault in that it doesn't resource media properly, and that's because we don't pay for it anymore. So the thing is to work with rather than against. Writing letters to the editor saying, you don't know what you're doing and you're not covering it right doesn't work. Making contact and saying, can we offer you an expertise, and so on. I'm out of time. I have a lot more information, which I'm happy to tell at other times, but I'm going to hand over because I'm done.
Okay, that's a really stimulating and very intriguing set of issues and questions to start off with.